Laba diena, and thank you for joining me on this episode. Today I'm gonna make a plant stand. I've been collecting these specific pieces of wood. Most of them have some soft spots, some of them are entirely rotten, but they have one thing in common. They are perfect for epoxy projects. And that's what we're gonna do today. I already looked through and I think we're gonna take this piece. So I was looking at it and it has to be root system of some sort of wood. And if I would have to guess, I would say it's alder. Anyway, what I'm gonna do next is clean all the bark and all the dust and loose parts. Probably I will square it up a little bit and then I will soak up in slow setting epoxy. So all the soft spots would soak the epoxy and eventually harden. The epoxy has set, and I'm not sure how about you, but I think it lost some of its charm due to lack of contrast. And I would love to bring it back. But also I would like to preserve as much of a wood texture as possible. So my plan is to mix some resin with white dye, keeping it transparent, and paint only the sides of the piece. But the only problem with epoxy resin is that it cures slowly and it can leak inside. So my idea is to use polyester resin because I can adjust the curing time by adding more or less catalyst. So I think it will be ideal for this application. So I obviously put too little pigment into the resin, and also I forgot how tangy the polyester resin is. So I guess I will mix one more batch with more pigment, and I will apply it in my welding room where I have a better ventilation. You know what? I don't really like it. I don't like that the coverage is very uneven. I don't like the overall look. Plus it's left somewhat sticky and soft, so I guess I will leave it. So here's my plan B. And I'm thinking to exclude the priming process. I will just fill the bucket with epoxy and we will see where it goes. It's rather cold in the workshop, so maybe it won't develop too much bubbles. In ideal conditions, this type of resin should cure in 72 hours. But because I increased the regulated volume, it cured overnight. And I was a bit worried that it may form too much bubbles and nothing will be visible inside. But I left the workshop without any heating, so the temperature dropped to 11 degrees, and I believe that saved the piece. So as you can see, it still has a lot of bubbles inside, but I think that this makes the piece even more interesting. Anyway, the next step will be to cut this one end off and turn the piece on the lathe. Let's recap the previous steps. So once I took the casting out of the bucket, I glued a piece of plywood to secure it on the lathe, and I used masking tape and CA glue trick. But that didn't hold very well, so I eventually permanently glued the plywood with more CA glue. It was a bit more cleanup afterwards, but at least I was safe to turn the piece. And once this was done, a lot of voids and open bubbles showed up, and I decided to fill this one with more epoxy. And my initial plan was to suspend the piece so I could fill the epoxy from all sides, but a lot of bubbles got trapped underneath, so eventually I just pressed it down, and yeah, and now I have this new casting. So my next job gonna be to pour some epoxy on the top, but I will be left with a seam line in between the layers. And to hide that, I will add a chamfer once the epoxy hardens, so the chamfer edge would meet with the seam line. I hope that makes sense. I've done that on my previous castings, and this seemed to work very well. I could gaze into it for hours. Finally it's finished and I can call this one done. And honestly, I was polishing on the lathe for the first time. And polishing process was fairly easy, but sanding was somewhat difficult. Mainly because when the piece was rotating, all the scratches were going at the same direction. And it was fairly hard to see whether I went through the previous grit or didn't I. So eventually I switched to hand sanding with the machine off, so I could alternate between sanding directions, and yeah, that saved the day. Anyway, I'm really stoked how it looks. It instantly reminds me of an ocean, and that's why I decided to dump a simple stand idea. I would like to make something more in a theme of ocean. I decided to sculpt some sort of a creature holding this piece. But to see that happen, you'll have to watch my next episode. So thank you for being with me, and bye.